the stuff you need to know about Australian history. On the 3rd of September 1939, Australian Prime Minister Bob Menzies announced to the nation that the United Kingdom had declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. The Second World War is well remembered in Australia for some historically good reasons and some not so historically good reasons. The government's first response to the war was to start recruiting troops for service in Europe. Japan's southward expansion also had national leaders concerned about the potential for a Japanese land invasion of Australia. However, there's very little historical evidence to suggest such an invasion was intended. While there were a number of individual Japanese soldiers agitating for an invasion of Australia, the leaders of the army, the navy, and Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo were opposed to the proposal. Simply put, nobody who actually had any say in the matter thought a Japanese invasion of Australia was a good idea. The Japanese army was fighting the 5th year of a war with China, and the necessary diversion of troops from northern China would open them up to an attack from the Soviet Union. The Soviets were by then at war with Germany, of whom Japan was an ally. After the war, Tojo conceded that Japan could not have invaded Australia because it never had enough troops to do so. Instead, the Japanese resolved to isolate Australia by bombing Darwin and a number of other locations in 1942 and 1943. The idea was Australians would be intimidated into not supporting the various countries of Southeast Asia that Japan was colonising in its imperial expansion. This ended up working about as well as the Japanese plans to intimidate the United States into neutrality by bombing Pearl Harbor, and following the harbour's bombing in 1941, Australian Labor Prime Minister John Curtin issued a declaration of war on Japan. Over the course of the Pacific War, Australians would fight alongside American troops, with American General Douglas MacArthur taking charge of Australian-American military strategy in the Pacific. Britain remained largely uninterested in the Pacific War due to the ongoing war in Europe. This is important as it shows the first time in Australian history that Australia turned away from Britain and looked to America, a trend that has continued to this day. Curtin famously announced,
"Australia looks to the United States, free of any pangs to our traditional links of kingship to the United Kingdom."
He then spent much of the rest of the war and his life trying to mitigate Churchill's anger over that particular comment. The most famous Australian campaign of the war is the Kokoda Trail, which was conducted from July to November 1942. The divisions in the campaign were made up mostly of Australian troops. It was this campaign that held Port Moresby for the Allies as they finally managed to push the Japanese northward. Although the Kokoda Trail didn't save Australia from invasion, as it is often credited as having had, it is still important to remember the sacrifice of the soldiers who fought in it, 30,000 of whom lost their lives. And this is important for the war in general. The fact that there was no threat of invasion directly to Australia does not diminish the sacrifice of Australian soldiers in fighting against Japanese imperialism. The fear of invasion would have another important side effect after the war ended. Ben Chifley had taken over as Prime Minister following Curtin's death 1 month before Japan surrendered. Just a quick side note, people often say that Curtin's heart attack was stress-induced, but it probably had more to do with his poor diet, fondness for grog in his early life, and lifetime of smoking. Just a thought. Anyway, after the war, the Australian government wanted to safeguard the nation against future invasion and saw its small population as its chief weakness. The population stood at only 7 million, and Chifley believed a nation with the area of Australia needed at least triple that to adequately defend itself. Consequently, he created a new portfolio of immigration. Australia's first immigration minister, Arthur Calwell, announced to the Parliament that the nation had the choice to populate or perish. However, Australia's preferred source of immigration, the United Kingdom, was unable to provide the necessary numbers, so Calwell began a mass immigration scheme which focused on continental Europe. Europeans were assisted in their passage to Australia, with the move costing only £10, hence the name £10 Poms. The scheme was radical in that it overcame Australian prejudices against continental Europeans. In 1947, the laws were even amended, allowing permanent residence to non-Europeans who had entered Australia illegally and remained for 15 years. If you come in legally, though, you are forever ineligible for permanent residence. Go figure that out. It's important to remember, though, that Australia's post-war immigration was a shift within, not away from the White Australia policy. The acceptance of continental Europeans was a redefinition of the white to which White Australia policy referred, not an acceptance of multiracialism or even multiculturalism. The European immigrants were expected to adopt typical Australian lifestyles and forget their previous ways of life. And at a time that the government was accepting its former wartime enemies from Germany and Italy, its wartime allies, the Chinese, were still turned away. Another post-war development was global, the Cold War. More on that next time. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you then.